Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Well, it's going to be a bucket full of acorns is what it's going to be.
Bucket full of acorns.
Yeah.
So, we're still talking about that, huh?
Yeah, I feel like people just haven't gotten enough. We
Yeah.
went all the way through October, a bunch of episodes. We got a bunch of feedback from that. People seem to like several things that we talked about. And there were a few things that maybe they didn't like.
Yeah. And I've been hearing from several listeners recently that they're sitting in tree stands in nice weather, oftentimes listening to acorns fall while we're talking about them. So we definitely got the short end of this stick.
I wish we were recording in a tree stand. I've gotten three that I can think of right off the top of my head. Direct communications to me from people how much they appreciated the squirrel death match, death games.
Yeah. I've gotten one that I can think of, but yeah, that's definitely something that people were fascinated by. Why wouldn't they be?
Well, and also if they're sitting on a deer stand, you know they're sitting there looking at a bunch of squirrels.
Yeah. Probably thinking about shooting one now and then.
Yeah, and it's like, wow, okay, I didn't even, like, it seems so random, when you're sitting there watching them. But
yeah. My dad always made me feel like my brain didn't work right when I would tell him I thought about shooting squirrels from a deer stand. But so it was like later on in life when I talked to other people that feel the same way that I felt validated.
I even have, when I was early on bow hunter, like, in the 10, 11, 12 age range, I had a judo tip, arrow on my quiver.
Yeah. I've done that.
For shooting small game.
Somehow over all these years, though, I've still managed to avoid pulling the trigger on a centerfire rifle at a squirrel.
Well, that's good. Good for you. That is restraint.
Does that mean I have good self-control?
I do think that's what that means.
All right. I mean,
you didn't shoot a raccoon with a 270. Good for you.
I have done that, actually.
See? Here you are, telling us one thing and doing another.
Do we need to edit that out? I don't know.
Is that illegal? I'm not going to say anything else.
Statute of limitations have passed on it, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, what were you, like 7? Yeah, so...
Maybe a little older than that.
Well, what do we have left to talk about with oaks?
What competes for them?
That's a good one.
In particular, down here we think about pigs a lot.
Yeah. Well, I think people are worried about pigs and how they're affecting turkeys, and we've talked about some of those ways, and we've probably brought up multiple times that they're competing with food. I definitely think that is a relevant conversation for us to have. Especially right now where, oaks are raining them down.
Yeah. And it's easy, I think, for people's minds to go to pigs first because they're a non-native invasive species. They're a relatively large animal. So, the opportunity for that resource competition between pigs and turkeys is probably really high. It certainly is really high. There's no denying that. But, acorns are a significant food resource across a suite of species, as we've already talked about over the past several weeks. And, in a lot of areas, there's way more deer for example, than there are pigs. So deer can, be a
Mhm.
competitor for that food resource as well. And whether you're mad about that or happy about it depends on your perspective and objectives, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, just more broadly, I don't think anyone's realistically trying to cut down on their deer consumption of acorns, but I think it'll be fascinating as we get into some of this, particularly with this study that I dove into, to just kind of think about and talk about how all these different species are competing over that same food resource.
Yeah. Yeah. I got a question kind of on a related note asking about competition for insects.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I think it's, something that people are thinking about.
Yeah.
A lot of people are probably thinking about it right now because apparently they're sitting on a tree stand listening to us while they're in a, in a oak flat or something.
Yeah. I just hope nobody's missed a shot at a deer because they had earbuds in and they didn't hear that mature buck sneaking up behind
Yeah, I
them.
don't know how I feel about that. Like they're not getting to hear nature and
Yeah.
there. Could you do an owl call or something so they get a little fix of it?
I took the dog out last night before bed, and I had a pair of them going pretty good. Probably a couple hundred yards from the house,
Yeah,
and I had to sit there till I called them in.
yeah. There you go.
And at this point, my wife isn't even surprised by that anymore.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's another reason for us to gobble in here. I bet somebody was sitting in the tree stand that last episode where we had a couple of gobbles,
Yeah,
that had to get put in. Uh, I can imagine sitting there listening to us on the tree stand and all of a sudden a gobble happens.
yeah. If it was me, couldn't help but think, man, I wish I was down on the ground and it was turkey season
I know.
instead of deer season.
Yeah, it's like torture more than anything.
All right, so let's jump into this one.
Yeah, let's do it.
So the main study that I took a little bit of a deep dive on is Fay et al. 2023, and they had a pretty cool, kind of unique experimental design to try to quantify competition for acorns, and they were specifically interested in pig use. Like, so their central question was, what proportion of acorns are pigs potentially taking, and how does that potentially affect other species of wildlife?
Mhm.
But they quantified every species that consumed acorns, so it had some really good relevant information in it.
Yeah.
And this was also produced by one of my colleagues, Dr. Steve Ditchkoff's lab. So we recently had one of his former graduate or current graduate students on, Matt McDonough, talking about his master's research, and now he's moved on into a PhD.
Mhm.
And Ariel Fay was also in that lab too, and she was the lead author on this. So this was her master's research.
Okay.
So it took place in East Central Alabama, so right here, and it was on a site. There's this is an area that's known for pretty high feral pig density. So that starting pig density, drumroll please, I already did the conversion on it from pigs pigs per square kilometer to pigs per square mile, and they had about 23 of them per square mile.
Okay. So it's pretty fair
Yeah.
density of
Yeah,
pigs.
yeah. You're not. It's probably not going to be that uncommon to run across a pig in a place like that.
Yeah.
Their total study area encompassed about 8,500 acres, so pretty large area.
Mhm.
So the way that they did this is they had a pre-pig removal period and a post-pig removal period. So they were wanting to compare and contrast pig consumption of acorns before and after density manipulation. And so each year of the study, they were looking at consumption over the months of October to February. And within each of those months, they had a 2-week trial. So for half of the month, across a 5-month period, they were putting acorns out and they had cameras positioned over them and they were looking at relative consumption by species. So they did this pre and post pig removal.
What it was only one species of oak?
No, so that was one thing that I wish they'd gotten into a little bit more detail about in the methods, but they had 40 oaks that they used as kind of their observation points where the cameras were set up. So they were in the drip line of these 40 oaks, and they were distributed between 13 white oak species. So they didn't identify with any greater level of specificity than white oak group versus red oak group. So 13 of those trees were white oak group trees, and 27 of those trees were red oak group trees. And so what they did is they cleared an area under each of these trees, and then they used play sand, like you'd put in a
Hmm.
sandbox, just white, clean sand in a 3x3 area. And the
Yeah.
reason they did that is they wanted to have a high contrast backdrop. And then they
Yeah.
placed the acorns in the sand. They had the camera positioned over it, and so then they could document which animals came by and consumed acorns.
Yeah. We could cut in some footage from Mariah Bogus's work. We have some footage of animals coming in and using acorns in that study, and
Mm-hmm.
we did the very similar thing to what they're
Yeah.
doing, where
Okay.
we had that white sand. We
Yeah.
actually used frisbee upside down to hold, to kind of make it a defined
Mm-hmm.
um, bit of sand. So
Mm-hmm.
because we wanted to count the number of acorns per species,
Mm-hmm.
ours was designed for a different reason, but
Right.
that'll at least show people
Yeah.
how contrasting that is. It makes
Yeah.
it really
And I
easy to see.
and I think, one of the easy criticisms to make about this is that, how does having that bright white sand background influence, an animal's choice whether or not to consume that acorn? And especially with turkeys being as sensitive to novel stimuli visually as
Mhm.
they are. I mean, all you have to do is like you read, Illumination in the Flatwoods, and Hutto talks all the time about
Yeah.
how anything that was unnatural or that stuck out to turkeys, they were immediately scared or inquisitive about it.
Yeah. Well, even like with me sitting in a blind trying to get them to come walk in front of a net, we're gonna fire over them. Like we're going through great lengths to try to hide that thing, and every once in a while, like the turkeys seem real spooky and don't come. And it's like,
Yeah,
dang, the wire was exposed for 1 foot, like or
exactly.
something little like that. You would never
Yeah.
think. So yeah, we've heard that criticism, when we've done work like this. But one thing that was important in our study is we were standardizing across the treatments. But in this case, the problem could be that you can't standardize it because some species might be inquisitive because of the sand,
Yeah.
whereas other species might be deterred by it.
Yeah. Yep.
Or,
Absolutely.
the acorns may be easier to find because of the sand for some or whatever it is. But, that's an assumption you're having to make with that study design.
Yeah, and this is something that we've talked about a little bit before. No experimental design is perfect, right? So
Right.
sometimes we solve one problem only to create another. And that's,
Yeah.
potentially what we've done here. But what
Well,
you hope,
but I think it's a pretty fair assumption.
yeah, yeah.
Like, it doesn't I trust the results. I've done a lot of work like this, and
Hmm.
I don't think the sand really matters that much.
Well, and the other
So
thing too is maybe it increases consumption in some species, and maybe it decreases consumption in others. But you would hope that there is enough consistency in how it affects those preferences that you can at least still identify the general trends or the relative
yeah.
use of acorns among species, because that's what really matters here. So, like, as we start going into these percentages of consumption by species, keep in mind the exact number doesn't matter as much as the change or the
Mhm.
relative differences between species.
That's right. Yep. I think that's a good point.
So, they had the trail cameras, they were monitoring, and they were putting out acorns 2 weeks out of every month from October to February. And so basically, they would place acorns in these squares and leave them out for the 14-day period. And then they paired those with acorn traps under each tree so that they could estimate the timing and abundance of masting, because they thought that that might be an important covariate that was driving some of the observations that they accrued during this study. One thing that I will mention as kind of a side note before we start jumping into the results is they said that they observed one instance of a person removing 2 acorns from the sand. Have you ever had that happen?
I don't think so.
And it's got to be out in the middle of the woods somewhere, so it's probably
Yeah.
somebody that's hunting. And I
Well,
guess between the scat stories that we've talked about before and this acorn story, I mean, hunters are an inquisitive bunch.
yeah.
Or maybe it's just that we get bored and desperate sometimes, and so we just start fiddling around like kids in the woods, like me shooting
Yeah.
squirrels,
Wait, it wasn't me, was it? Yeah, I do. And I was telling my lab a story. Uh, it was just a few days ago. I have been collecting some live oak acorns because I wanted to grow a cohort of those this year.
hmm
And my kids have kind of gotten involved and helped me, do that a couple of times. And I went to get in a chair, and there was an acorn stuck in the little crease of it.
right in
So
the
I
middle.
picked it up. Yeah, so I picked it up, and I was like, "All right, who got the acorn?" And they at first, kind of, I got the sense that they thought maybe I was mad about it, and I was
Yeah,
like, "No, no, no, no. I'm happy you got the acorn."
yeah, that's funny.
But they're like, have pockets full of acorns now, so
Oh yeah,
I
my
appreciate that.
my kids, it's like rocks and acorns are
Yeah.
prized possessions anytime we go out somewhere.
Yeah, it's like they have a value in the trade,
Do yours pick up rocks too?
Um, I can't think of. I know that they used to,
Yeah,
but I can't think of, when my older one was the age of my younger one, she did, but I
yeah.
don't think either of them do that much
Well, I
now.
think what started it with our daughter is we got her a rock tumbler last Christmas. So she was always looking for interesting rocks to
Oh,
put in her tumbler.
yeah,
And I think that's what got it started. And little brother, of course, was following along. And so
yeah,
I think that developed in him a habit. It's like, hey, picking up rocks is something we do around here.
yeah,
But what's funny is they like gravel rocks almost more than anything. It's just like I'm like, that's just a piece of gravel, and my son will have his pocket just bulging,
yeah,
about to burst at the seams, carrying around. It's almost like pulling down his shorts.
yeah, that's
So
hilarious.
they're funny. But okay, so jumping into the results, just hitting you with some of the numbers first. So they removed 443 pigs between pre and post treatment, and that would just as a reminder, that was across 8,500 acres, but that's still a solid effort.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
lot of pigs.
they captured
How many did you say?
443.
Alright,
And so let's see. I'm gonna I'm gonna do some
do the
math
math.
on a calculator,
Oh,
not in
no.
my head.
I was trying to do it in my head, but I wasn't gonna verbalize it.
Let's see. So 443. They actually removed pigs at a higher density than their starting density estimate. So their starting density estimate was 23 pigs a square mile, and they were removing them at a rate of 34 per square mile. That's a lot.
Yeah, that seems good.
So they captured over 7 million images. They observed 2,200 acorns in the sand in front of the cameras. And of those 2,000 acorns, about 700 were consumed by 15 different wildlife species. So right at about a third of the acorns were consumed. Peak acorn drop was October to November the first year, and it shifted a little bit later, November to December the other year. And my guess would be that probably is species driven. With
Mhm.
like we talked about in one of our recent episodes, how timing of drop can shift a little bit. So
Yeah.
probably different species producing between years. Um, but what was really interesting to me that I did not expect, and this is why I wanted to put that caveat on it at the beginning about, whether or not the play sand attracts or repels certain species. So turkeys consumed less than, well, the exact statement is coyotes, which that's not a surprise, turkeys, that is a surprise, and a turtle consumed less than 1% of the acorns.
So a turtle ate an acorn?
A turtle ate an acorn.
You should have led with that.
Well, I'm trying to sprinkle them throughout. You know, we had the human earlier, now we have the acorn-eating turtle.
I need to see the video of the turtle eating an acorn.
We need to make a Wild Turkey Science shirt, acorn turtle. And he
Well,
could like make his little shell be like a acorn cap.
yeah. I mean, what kind of turtle was it? Does
I
it
wish they had identified it. They didn't.
is it
I
a
mean,
box turtle?
you got to assume it's an eastern box turtle.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm bouncing that one around.
Yeah, maybe we'll get.
That's a species that I have not observed through any of these studies. None of the students that have worked on this. We've
Yeah,
never seen a turtle eat an acorn.
yeah.
But you were surprised also. I don't want to completely steer us away before we have time to discuss it.
Mm-hmm.
You were surprised that turkeys were responsible for less than 1%.
Mm-hmm.
Even when you put the three together, still less than 1%.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's why I would love to see what species they are. Because if it was swamp chestnut oak in the white oak group and
Exactly.
northern red oak, then that'd make perfect sense.
Exactly. Yeah, they're just too big, and turkeys have low
Yeah.
preference for them.
Yeah, but if it was, willow oak and water oak and post oak, then I would be really, really surprised.
But I understand why they didn't incorporate that into their design, because they're mostly interested in looking at pig consumption.
Yeah.
And, pigs will eat all of it, any and all of the above. So, of the acorns consumed, here's the total breakdown. Pigs consumed the most at 23%. So pigs were of the acorns consumed. So that's not of all acorns. That doesn't mean that of the 2,200, pigs consumed 23% of that. It's just the ones that got eaten. Of those, pigs were responsible for 23% of them. Deer were neck and neck with pigs at 21%. Squirrels were right up there with the other two, with deer and pigs at 19%. And then you go coons at 7%, birds at 7%, and then armadillos at 4%.
That's interesting.
And that was combined. That was combined across years.
So we have 3 species that are removing 3/4 of the.
That's right.
Or almost 3/4.
Yeah.
70% roughly.
Yeah. And it's interesting how it's so evenly split between pigs, deer, and squirrels. You go 23%, 21%, 19%.
Okay, well, but they have that same data before and after the removal, right?
They do. That I'm sorry, I misspoke earlier. That is before the removal.
Yeah.
Okay?
That's what I assumed.
So post removal, this is where it gets interesting. Squirrel doubled at 40%. So squirrel consumption went from 19% to 40% post removal.
So pigs are out competing squirrels for the acorns.
Seems that way.
Well, the interesting thing about this, just kind of reflecting on this from the work that I've been involved with, we did a paper and we had, I don't know, maybe 24 sites all over the Southeast where we had cameras and we were looking at behavior of wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
And we had 3 or 4 species that we focused on. This was Dykstra et al. That we published last year. And the point of our paper was to see whether or not wild pigs were influencing the behavior of those other species.
Mm-hmm.
So just being present, is it causing them to change behaviorally, like their activity pattern and things like that? Well, one of the ones that had the biggest effect was squirrels.
Yeah. Yeah.
I always thought that was weird. It's like, well, they could just be up in the tree, but
Yeah.
like that's what? If I had to guess, what's happening with the squirrels is when there are pigs present, they're eating more acorns from the canopy. That would be what I would draw from that most likely.
Well, what I was wondering is whether it's yeah, so like are they like we're talking about two things here, right? So there's the potential for behavioral exclusion of
Yeah.
of pigs, of squirrels at the feeding site. And
Right.
then the other way is, through the more direct competition where pigs are consuming acorns that are no longer available to squirrels.
Right.
And so does the squirrel consumption go up because the pigs are gone and no longer disturbing the squirrels, or because the pigs are gone and now there's more acorns left for the squirrels?
Well, I guess
Or can we
wouldn't
disentangle
necessarily.
that?
Yeah. Well, there's multiple ways that you could see the same pattern,
Yeah.
right? And the competitive exclusion would that would in theory lead to fewer squirrels to remove acorns.
Mm-hmm.
But the behavioral mechanisms could be a couple. One, there could be just as many squirrels, and they just eat more of the acorns in the canopy, which is what
Yeah.
like it's higher risk to go down to the ground or whatever.
Yeah.
That makes them just eat more in the canopy.
Yeah.
But there could be the mechanism you were describing as well.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about squirrels lately.
Yeah.
Maybe we should move on. All right. So
Well,
squirrel.
like it.
Yeah. So squirrel consumption roughly doubled post removal. So post removal, squirrels are eating 40% of the acorns. Deer. This is interesting, and hold your thoughts on it because I'm going to circle back to it and bring another point in about deer. But deer didn't change that much. So they pre-removal they consumed 21%. Post removal they consumed 18%. Probably no statistical difference there. Raccoon consumption went up a little bit from 7 to 10% post removal. And then pig consumption went down from initially it was 23%, and then post removal it was 7%. But what was really fascinating to me about this is that before removal, acorn consumption of pigs peaked in December and was greater than deer throughout December, January, and February. Okay. After removal, squirrel and deer acorn consumption increased steadily throughout the entire period from October to February and peaked in February. So even though deer consumption of acorns did not go up post removal, the timing of use of acorns by deer did go up post removal.
So basically, when pigs are present, it's like there's this cumulative effect over time. The longer they're around, the more acorns they eat, the more it affects deer. Is that how you interpret that? Like through the season?
Yeah, I think so. I think it, and the other thing that's hard to disentangle here is what we keep getting back to is the species that were being consumed. And I almost wonder, like, how much of that timing shift is related to, the reduction in pig density versus how much of it is related to differences in the species composition of the acorn drop that year. And so maybe
Yeah.
the first year was white oak heavy and the second year was red oak heavy. And so red oak acorns, because they're available for consumption longer on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
that's why we saw the extended use of acorns by deer during the second year, even though the pigs were gone.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So this is all very complicated, but I think what's
Well, the same could explain the squirrel thing too.
exactly. That's what I was
Yeah.
going to get back to is like that's where all this gets really complicated is there's issues related to the acorns themselves that are dropping and being produced and the species' ability to use those or their preference for them. And then you've got the potential behavioral exclusion aspect to the pigs. And then you've got the food resource, consumption by the pigs that are all
Mhm.
factoring in. And it can be difficult to just, determine what is the exact mechanism that's driving these patterns that they observe.
Yeah. Well, and we're all researchers, and the authors of that paper included in this that we are trying to think through all these things and design the research so that there's not confounding problems.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes we don't articulate it well enough for someone on the outside that had nothing to do with it, like me.
Yeah.
Like, I may not be able to fully interpret this because I don't know what all of those are and they aren't in the paper. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what all the precautions were in the design and, what they were doing to accommodate different issues. And
Yeah.
sometimes you miss stuff. I mean, it's a super complex system and you either miss it or sometimes you can't accommodate things that could be an issue.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a good point, but it's really interesting, that the pigs seem to be having a big influence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
There's no
I
doubt
know
about that.
we beat this broken drum, but one thing that goes a long way to helping in this situation is if we had another site where they did the same thing and didn't remove pigs.
Mm-hmm.
So that before after control impact basically solves all these problems.
Yeah. Yep. Another difficult thing about this is it was a master study, and master
Yeah,
studies are by default going to be duration limited.
yeah,
So,
we always talk about that.
yep.
We can't get more than 2 years out of them.
Yep.
Sometimes we get 3, but rare.
So I know you had some other papers that you wanted to pull in. I had a little factoid here from Anderson, which you did not get to. The other paper that I had a little blurb from was Wood and Rourke. Did you get into that one?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so I'll share
We
both
went
of those.
completely different ways about this one.
Okay, and I'm not deep diving on these. I just have little blurbs. If you want to get more into the context of those studies, I'll have to pull them up. But these are just from the discussion of the Fay et al. Paper, and Wood and Rourke, 1980, found that this because this is where they were saying they expected really high consumption rates based on previous studies, and
Yeah.
specifically Wood and Rourke, 1980, found that acorns comprised 80% of the total dry weight of pig stomach contents in winter, and then using DNA metabarcoding, Anderson and others in 2018 found that 94% of sampled wild pig stomachs contained acorns.
Wow.
That's just, a couple of more blurbs that are indicative of the extent to which pigs use acorns and potentially compete, with other wildlife for that food resource.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, I knew they were important, and I think some of the stuff that I found will illustrate the importance of acorns to pigs.
Yeah.
But I didn't find any of the stuff that you just shared. Like, that's 90+% of their diet. That's crazy.
Yeah. So the one study found 80% of total dry weight, and the other study found that 94% had some acorns in them.
Yeah.
So that's like
Something occurring that
Yeah.
often in the diet that's pretty rare to find that in any species.
Absolutely.
Especially one like pigs that, I mean, they eat everything, right? They eat everything with a
Absolutely,
calorie
yeah.
in it. So for it to be that dominant of an item in terms of the frequency is crazy.
Yeah. I mean, we knew they eat a lot of acorns, but I mean, they are living off acorns during the fall
Yeah.
and winter when they're available.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It makes sense though, especially now in the context of some of the things I found. So I was really curious because I think we brought it up during October. How I know we talked about it in the context of turkeys. How is oak masting affecting reproduction and population size?
Yeah.
And I think we brought up something about pigs responding, and I told you that there was literature showing their populations being influenced by oaks.
Mm-hmm.
So I went and grabbed a couple of things,
Oh, nice.
papers that I could remember were showing that.
Mm-hmm.
And when I did that, they actually found a new one that was just published this year in 2024. This one is, we'll go with Shimada. Shimada.
It's funny. You always get the ones that are hard to pronounce.
SHIMADA. So we're
You know,
gonna
I just pre-filter all my papers, and if they have, I don't care how good the science is, if I can't pronounce it, I just throw it out.
yeah. So they just published this study from the Ryukyu Islands in Japan, which apparently has some Ryukyu wild boars on it.
See, I would have said, there's these islands in Japan that have pigs on them.
I don't know. I think it's more fun to try to say it. And they were tracking populations of pigs with camera grids for 14 years. So pretty cool study. And they
14
found,
years.
yeah. And they found with pig populations there that there was a strong negative density dependent relationship. And what that means is basically the relative population size now is negatively affected by what it was, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's just negative relationship. So you get a lot of pigs, that tends to decrease something like reproduction or survival or something, and now will be negative. And then when you have the lower population, it, often will cycle.
And it's been a long time since we talked about density dependence on here. But I think, Mark McConnell, when he came on the show, summarized it best. And it's just basically this concept that populations can't increase indefinitely.
Right.
They run out of something eventually.
Yeah, there's some sort of negative, and that's like a characteristic of ecology. It's just
exactly.
It's what happens. So anyway, the population size was negatively affected by negatively related to the previous year's population size, but it was positively affected by last year's abundance of acorns.
Mm-hmm.
So when massed years, that leads to more pigs. And they didn't just track the amount of pigs.
Mm-hmm.
They also looked at what they called the emergence of piglets.
Mm-hmm. Emergence of piglets.
Yeah.
Sounds like a Halloween show.
Yeah. So they found the same thing, but there are a couple of really unique things about it. The emergence of piglets was much higher in the year following the mast.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing I found more interesting is if you go and look at, let's see, which figure is it? Figure 3. In non-mast years, there were basically no piglets in January, February, or March, April. And in the mast years, they had this increase in the emergence of piglets. And a lot of that was attributed to them breeding earlier.
Mm.
So they're
the whole across the population, they were all breeding earlier.
Yes.
In the year.
Yeah, like all of a sudden, a lot of piglets were emerging in January through April timeframe.
Isn't that interesting how that works? Because we've talked about a couple of turkey studies on here before where they talked about well-fed hens nesting earlier.
Yeah. Well, we're going to draw some more parallels to turkeys here in a minute. I made note of another paper. It was the one I was going to look for when I found that one. And it's Cutini. And this one, I'm pretty sure that's how you say the name because it is an Italian name. But my Italian colleague here that makes fun of me for how I pronounce things, she can let me know if I said that wrong. Because she has told me that before. She thought it was hilarious that I brought up the Acer instead of Acer. So
hey, the only Italian word I know is spaghetti, so
yeah. Well, they've got some mountains over there. I think they call them the Apennini or something like that. Yeah,
somebody just turned us off.
Yeah. So that they were working up there and they found pulsed resources of chestnut, and this is the European chestnut, so it is Castanea, and turkey oak were positively affecting piglet abundance or piglet density, I guess is what they measured. So same thing. So the study that I was referencing when we brought this up recently in another episode was actually not either of those. It was Bieber and Bruff. And it's not Justin Bieber.
I was gonna say, man, is he
This
is he
was Claudia.
moonlighting? Is he a scientist moonlighting as a singer, or vice versa?
Man, he could get Wild Turkey Science out to so many more people. You know?
Ah, maybe he'll do a collab on a post, huh?
Yeah, I doubt it. So, this was Claudia Beaver, and Beaver and Ruff, 2005. They were looking at things that influence population dynamics of wild boar, and we'll put this in the show notes if you want to go look at it. It is quite interesting for lots of reasons, but this is what I wanted to bring here to see how you react to it. So they were tracking the vital rates of pig populations and looking at things that influence that. And they were quantifying the conditions in a given year as a poor environment, i.e., mast failure, or a good year or good conditions, good environmental conditions. That's what they say, as a boom crop.
Mm-hmm.
And they were looking at, I don't remember if folks, I think it was when we had Chitwood on when we first started talking about elasticity.
Mm-hmm.
That basically means the relative importance of a vital rate to the trajectory of a population,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we've talked a bunch about hen survival for turkeys being really important.
Right.
And that's what we mean is it is relatively important compared to other vital rates. Like
Right.
increases in that vital rate have a bigger effect on the population trajectory than something else. Well, in this study, they noted that when they're in poor environments or enduring mast failures, the elasticity of adult survival is the most important. It's the most elastic.
Mm-hmm.
When they are in good years, they observed a crossover ranking where reproduction became more important.
Yeah. That makes sense. I think I
Or
can follow that.
I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So the fact that hen survival is so important, I wonder if that would actually translate to, because they do have some similarities. Obviously, one's a mammal and one's not,
Yeah.
but they do have some similarities in terms of how their populations operate. And I just found that curious, like the poor environment, the adult survival is most important, but when the environment's good, the reproduction takes over.
That resonates from
Isn't
some
that
of the
something?
stuff that we're working on that we can't talk about just yet,
I know.
and some of the hypotheses that we have.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I found that really, really interesting. You know, not so I've just gone through a couple of papers showing you that wild boar populations are influenced, are connected, and this has been done in uh, three different places, showing this really distinctly that I found really quickly. But in this case, it's actually even changing which part of the population is most important for that population growth, and I just that resonated with me a lot for turkeys, but also I just find it really fascinating. Like oaks are driving how
It's
the
all
population's functioning.
It's almost yeah, exactly. It's almost influencing how the population is behaving relative to the logistic growth curve, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like in poor mast years, the population is behaving in a density dependent manner, and then good acorn years is almost behaving in a density independent manner.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that really cool?
And it can swap that fast, which is interesting because we typically think of like a population, whether it's behaving independent or dependent on density, we think of that being as a relatively long-lasting
Yeah.
designation, right? So we think about like a deer population that's over carrying capacity, that's a chronic issue.
Mm-hmm.
But this is saying that, masting, which is such a intense pulse resource, can immediately change how that population is behaving
Yes.
along that curve. That
And
is
it
really
makes a lot of
interesting.
sense when there's no mast, food is limiting and they're over carrying capacity. And then when you have a bone crop of acorns, or in this case, just lots of different kinds of mast, probably. I think there's a beech mast included in this. Yeah, beech mast is included. Uh, that resource becomes unlimited.
Yeah, you're changing carrying capacity.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Isn't that something? I thought that would be a fun discussion to have with you.
Did you get into any other demographic responses to acorns and other species?
I'd sort of scratched the surface
Because
of it
you
a little bit, but
because you reminded me of a deer study, and I pulled up the abstract a minute ago, and I didn't know if you wanted to get into that as well, because I don't know, just as we continue this conversation, it's just I think it's interesting, if not informative, and interesting to talk about how profoundly mast crops can affect reproduction in various species. And although we don't have the good turkey data, obviously these, like deer or something that a lot of our listeners are probably interested in as well. And it can help you, form hypotheses as to what's going on with turkeys as well. You want me to jump into it?
well, I mean, does it need to be long? I think
No,
we.
no.
Well, I do have one really important point that I want to be a take-home message, but let's do that first. Just don't
Okay.
let me forget my
Yeah, yeah.
important one because I did
Don't
not
forget your
cover it
take
yet.
home. Don't forget your take home.
Okay,
So
that's a
this
reminder.
was This was work done by Jim Wentworth and Sid Johnson back in the day at the University of Georgia. And the study was carried out in the Southern Appalachians. So keep in mind, we've talked about this before too, like the context of how important acorns are in terms of influencing vital rates and in terms of like how many of them are consumed is dependent on the landscape, right?
Mhm.
So like if you're in a mature hardwood forest dominated landscape like in the Southern Appalachians where this study was
Yeah, that would have
conducted,
been basically closed canopy hardwood for
yes.
miles in every direction
Yeah.
in most places.
So there's not a lot of other food. So you would expect in this scenario that deer would be more influenced by acorn crops than they would be in a more diverse landscape that has a variety of cover
Yeah.
types. Nonetheless, they found that in years of poor acorn production, kidney fat indices, which that's something that we oftentimes use as a physiological index of individual condition in deer. So kidney fat indices in winter are significantly lower for most sex and age classes. During these years, reproductive rates of yearling does are significantly lower, so it's affecting reproduction, and conception dates are significantly later. That gets back to that point that we were talking about earlier. Can affect timing of reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, However, reproductive rates of adults were not appreciably different, and that's another common thing that we see, especially in mammals. Um, adults are typically less influenced by or less sensitive to changes in resource availability than young animals are, yearlings are. Um, but acorn availability also appeared to influence recruitment, possibly through lowered postnatal survival following years of poor acorn production. And then just one other aside that I felt our listeners would be interested in: buck weights and antler development were significantly lower following years of poor acorn production, while weights of fawns were significantly correlated with the size of the acorn crop of the same year. So lots of influences going on there.
Mm-hmm.
But what was most interesting to me is how it influences recruitment and how it influences the timing of reproduction
Yeah.
from a turkey perspective.
Yeah. Very, very good. Very interesting stuff.
So what was your take home point?
Oh, well, I was thinking back to wild pigs. A lot of folks are actively trying to deal with pigs. And I just want to focus for a second, that paper that I covered, what does that actually functionally mean
Mm-hmm.
from if you're somebody that wants to get rid of pigs?
Yeah.
If you're in a landscape where they have an unlimited food resource, I'm sure you can think of some reasons that might occur. I see you smiling.
I'm not going to say it. You want me to say it, and I'm not going to. You can say
I
it.
thought I'd get you. I thought I was baiting you into it.
A bushel per square mile per day, right?
Yeah, if pigs are in that landscape where, they have the good environmental conditions, as they called it in that, which means that there's not a cap on the food source. What you're effectively saying is that reproduction is driving the population, or in other words, the adult's vital rate isn't as important. It's operating in that part of the population growth curve, like you're talking about, where the
Oh my
population
God.
has this potential that's nearly exponential.
God, that's profound.
You see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
you can't overcome that.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, you could think of, oh man, I'll let you explain it because I
No, you
feel like
go ahead.
I'm always the one that does this. But um, when we remove pigs, we're focusing a lot on increasing adult mortality, decreasing
Yeah.
survival. But you're saying that in a landscape that is food subsidized, whether it be through acorns or corn or kern, acorns or kern, um, that it's more elastic to reproduction, right?
Yeah, which is
So
decreasing the relative importance of the adult.
exactly, it's decreasing the relative importance of what you're doing through your trapping efforts or your otherwise killing
Yeah.
efforts,
And
however you're
so in
doing it.
other words, it's making that less effective.
So there's a scientific reason to say that corn is like pouring gas on a fire when it comes to pigs.
Yes. Yes. That's all I got to say about that. I just when I read that again, I was just like, "Oh, man." Like, I just went back to it again. I got back into that place like, "Man, we're sitting here trying to deal with pigs."
You know what I wish somebody would do is tag a bunch of pigs in areas where baiting is a frequent, widespread practice, and compare vital rates to areas where it's not. I mean, I don't think we have those data, do we?
No, we've got it in the oak systems. There's several showing when you have a big mast year, you have a big reproduction and higher survival and all that. And that results in more pigs, like a higher pig abundance. And we have that in agricultural systems when, they have essentially unlimited food. Sometimes that is corn fields, that they operate that way. So I don't think it's that much of a step out on the limb to think that, providing it ad libitum somewhere else on the landscape might have a similar effect.
Yeah. I was about to jump into the timeline for the changes in regulations related to that practice and comparing it to, you know, trends in turkey populations, but I think we've hit that dead horse a few times too.
Well, and the pig, the crazy thing for pigs, and I don't know if folks have seen this before. I guess we could cut it in. It's easy to find. The USDA has range expansion maps of wild pigs,
Yeah.
and they've been in Florida since the 1500s.
Mhm.
And they've been in a couple of isolated locations, like they were in California, up in the Southern Appalachians, and there were a few populations. Texas had some, and they just sat there
Yeah, for a
for like
long
hundreds of
time.
years.
Yeah.
And then in like around 1980, all of a sudden it exploded. Now they're in 46 states, I think.
Yeah. I knew some guys growing up in South Alabama that, when I was a little kid, they were like friends of my dad's that were pig hunters,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember they worked pretty hard to kill pigs in South Alabama at that time.
Yeah.
Like, they were into it. I mean, they went through a
Yeah.
lot of effort to kill pigs. It wasn't like it is now. And
Yeah.
they had been in South Alabama for quite a long time at that point.
Yeah. So my point is just over a really short amount of time, in the grand scheme of things, I mean, they've been here since 1500s. That's since 1980, they had that kind of range expansion,
Yeah.
and they're vacuuming up the acorns. I mean, every squirrel in the eastern United States has to eat their acorns on the limb now,
Mm-hmm.
because all the pigs, and the population should be operating in most places under that kind of range of elasticities, I guess.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
wait.
we've been talking about the food resource competition today, but we haven't even talked that much about the behavioral exclusion that we covered with Matt, a
Yeah.
few episodes ago. And so you just think about that range expansion and increase in abundance of pigs, and essentially it's almost taking away habitat the same way development is by excluding turkeys from that area.
Yeah.
Like, areas that were formerly turkey habitat are no longer because the abundance of pigs there.
Yeah.
And then you couple that with the disease concerns and how we might be supplementing nest predators, particularly raccoons.
Yeah. Pig's bad. All right, we're gonna end up on a diatribe here if we have.
I think we already did.
Okay. Anything else that you had to cover?
Nope, that was it.
I've been hanging on to that one, and we canceled our last recording time to talk about it, and I was like, can't
Yeah,
hold this much longer.
that's been hard to keep under your hat
I know it.
for a couple weeks.
Yeah. So
Yeah. Have we covered it all, or do we need to put a bow on this thing? I think we
got it.
we got it.
That was a fun episode. Really cool to cover some of these new research items that have come out, still related to oaks. I think we might have we have one more that's popular request from the audience, and we're going to get into some oak ecology with it.
Yeah.
But I don't want to unveil that because Will doesn't know what I'm talking about right now. But we do have a couple episodes planned based on what people are asking for. So they'll be kind of fun episodes around Thanksgiving, I think.
Cool.
We'll launch them.
Yeah. All right. Well, I look forward to those.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for listening. We really appreciate it.
Thank y'all. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.